welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast. I'm Josh Durso, and we are here in the FingerLakes1.com studio in North Park on the third floor of our brand new studio. Jackie, how you been?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Okay, so we have got a lot to talk about today.
Yes.
We have a lot of really diverse issues to jump into. Some of them are familiar. We've talked about them a few times, but others, there's some new ones that are pretty interesting.
There's a lot of stuff going on around here lately.
So let's start by jumping into one of the topics that has drawn a lot of, we've been talking about it for what feels like ever.
Yeah.
New rules for the Seneca Falls Town Board meetings. Maximum capacity of it. So I'm going to run through what the new rules were that were handed down by the town board, Supervisor Lazaro and Chief of Police Stu Painstra sort of worked together to come up with these rules as a guideline moving forward for town board meetings. Maximum capacity of 80 will be observed in the board room, we'll call it. It's really just the town courtroom. It's a small room, so that the 80 capacity, I would say, is a little bit generous. That's with people kind of packed in there like sardines, I feel like. All of those present must remain seated unless speaking at the podium. No signs. That's a continuation of what we already knew. And then metal detectors will also be used. I guess I'm kind of curious what your feeling is on particularly the metal detector part.
Well, I mean, that didn't jump out at me as much as some of the other things because in Geneva, the Geneva City Council meets in the courtroom at the police station, so there are metal detectors there also. Right. But, that meeting area was supposed to be temporary and became the permanent meeting space for Geneva. So I guess that didn't strike me as the kind of strangest of that list. The no signs thing, I think I still don't quite understand. If they're saying that maybe the signs take up space, it makes me wonder if somebody walks in with a shirt that has a message on it, that is technically political signage of some sort. Would they be asked to leave? I mean, it's not clear what the motivation behind not allowing the signs is because it's just a ban. It's not really a justification.
So I guess through our coverage, I had a couple conversations with Supervisor Lazaro, and he essentially said that a big reason for these new rules were because of two things: the continued negative rhetoric, his words, not mine, in Seneca Falls and throughout the area on this subject, and also the shooting that took place where Representative Scalise was shot at a baseball practice in Virginia. I have trouble feeling like that's good, true justification for what feels like very authoritarian rules, although some of them are totally common sense rules, like, fire code. Of course, you should always be observing that. Mm-hmm. That said, I think you start to get into a gray area where you have to almost, if the agenda looks like it could draw a larger crowd, that you need to make some sort of accommodation.
Right. Like if you recognize your space isn't big enough for everybody who wants to come to your meeting, why is it the public's fault that they're interested instead of the town board's burden to find a place that can accommodate people?
Right.
I mean, that they should. I also had a discussion with the supervisor, and my sense, and he's free to disagree about my takeaway from the conversation, but my sense of it was that he doesn't like the content of the speech, that he thinks that the things that people are saying make people bristle, seems offensive, and in my view, there are ways that you can communicate what the community standards are for what can be said and how it can be delivered that don't cross the line into just censoring particular points of view. And but Geneva can't seem to get that right either. So it's not like and I tried to explain to him, I'm not trying to single him out as somebody who's got a bad procedure. I think Geneva's equally guilty of that. But I think sometimes people in public office don't understand that it goes with the territory that people will be critical.
Right.
And you have to allow space for that. Granted, it's crossing a line if somebody's trying to incite violence, but people are entitled to disagree and to express that. And if you don't let them express it, it's going to come out somewhere. They're going to find a way to make that point clear. So why not just let people have their say at the meeting?
Well, so as far as I know, I haven't been told or I haven't heard of any instances of violence or threatened violence against any elected officials here in Seneca Falls.
Except between elected officials?
Sure.
Okay.
But the idea, this is singling out the people
Right.
on the other side of the desk.
Right.
It's a pretty clear delineation there. That said, I kind of feel like Seneca Falls is starting to pile up with these really sort of concepts that sit poorly with people. So you've got this new set of rules. You had some signs that disappeared out of people's yards, a little bit of vandalism from signs. I just feel like the town made the decision a few weeks ago, and as far as I know, it has not been reversed, where they started to draw a line in the sand about where signs could sit on people's property, where town right-of-way was. And it just seems to me that when you have something like that happen, you go through what will be now two separate legal matters that aren't very pretty and don't really sit
Right.
well with the entire community. Then you add this on top of everything. It just seems like there's a piling on that isn't entirely necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And again, I think my concern is that history has shown, locally, nationally, internationally, that if people are stirred up or upset about something, the worst response you can have is to try to buckle down, tighten up, constrain people's speech. Because at the base of it, most people just want to feel like they're being heard and that the points that they're making can be validly considered and weighed against other people's points of view. And I think when you start treating citizens like a heavy-handed parent who's trying to shut down a temper tantrum, you're headed in the wrong direction. You're not really doing right by the people. So that continues to be my concern about all of these rules, is that they seem arbitrary, they don't seem like they'll be effective, and I think they just in the long run make matters worse.
And I do believe in Seneca Falls there is precedent to hold meetings in separate venues. We've had
Right.
Public comment sessions in the rec center a long time ago. I believe there were a string of village board meetings back when there was a village in Seneca Falls that were held at the Minders Academy Auditorium. So there is this. They could if they wanted to.
Right.
And I just think that at this point, as you start to near this, I also think a really worthy takeaway from this set of rules is that this venue, the new town offices, was poorly derived in every way.
Yeah, it certainly has not suited
does
any of their
not
objectives.
it does not fit
Right.
what the town needs in terms of even just turnout for a board meeting, for God's sakes. That, to me, I think if you strip away the landfill part of the debate, that's really the interesting takeaway for me here. It's that this is essentially them admitting the sign is too cramped, or the room is too small and cramped for signs. So signs are no good.
Right.
It also creates because it's so small, it creates what feels like a hostile environment.
Right.
Everyone has to be seated because it is such a small room. If you have people standing around the side, it makes the room feel even smaller. Using metal detectors, observing a capacity issue when your capacity is only 80 people. I mean, these are things that kind of all point back to saying this building just didn't cut it or doesn't cut it. So I think that's kind of where my head is now, because I am resigned personally to the idea that this landfill debate, this landfill issue, it's not going anywhere. It's here.
Well, it's not, because there's a new twist or turn every couple of weeks. And, that was another point that I tried to make to the supervisor when we were speaking, that it's not just a matter of people coming up and saying they don't like the landfill every single meeting. It's that every meeting there's some new nuance or wrinkle, whether it's odor or expansion or lawsuits back and forth. And each of those is a new issue that people want to comment on. Mm-hmm. So that, and I guess this goes to another point that I wanted to talk about later when we get to our hits and misses. If he is worried that people are just saying the same thing over and over, that it smells and they don't like the smell, well, then give people an outlet where they can register that complaint so they don't have to come to a town board meeting just to get up and say, I smell it every day. But,
right.
There are other solutions for creating ways for people to be part of the process. If one's not working, open up more. But this idea that you just keep closing things down, it backfires. It's not a good strategy.
Okay, so while we are on the Seneca Falls and landfill topic, your takeaway, I guess, on the Environmental Affairs Committee at the county board level,
right.
Passing barely by the skin of their teeth 3-2 an odor complaint system, which would be on their website, on the county's website. Your thoughts on that and the sort of heated debate that happened while it was all unfolding?
Yeah, I couldn't really understand the argument of the two people who voted against it, because it was a 3-2 vote. So Supervisor Trout had said, well, we might as well leave this in committee because it's never going to pass the full board anyway.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's kind of, you shouldn't prejudge the effect of the full board. A committee is there to recommend. If you think it's a good idea, you recommend. If you don't think it's a good idea, you don't recommend. Okay, so let me jump in quickly on that point. I believe, and this is just through some conversations I've had with other supervisors, this had already gone to the full board last month. Oh, okay.
It was first presented to the full board last month. However, they referred it back to committee because I think there was a pretty clear indication, if you were at that meeting, that the measure was not going to pass. But they didn't officially vote. They voted to send it back to committee, right. And that was so that brought us to Tuesday night. Right. So I guess again, if you're in a committee, your job is to say, based on our specialized information in this committee and what we think we're supposed to be operating under those parameters, we either forward this or we don't. Mm-hmm. And even if you think people aren't going to vote for it, if you really think it's the right thing to do, it should go forward. But then you had Supervisor Lazaro. His comments were, in essence, that it was kind of a slap in the face to Seneca Meadows. That if they, I think his direct quote was, "You don't seem to trust this business to collect their own data." Right. Yes, that exactly should be the county's position. It's not about whether you like a business or not. It's that if you're in a regulatory compliance question, you don't let the potentially out-of-compliant agency, right? You're trying to track their performance. You don't let them evaluate themselves. It would be like letting your employees do their own salary adjustments. That's just not how things work. You have to collect objective, independent data. So to say that somehow, well, we shouldn't let people complain about the odor because we should just let the landfill register its own odor complaints, I
I really don't understand how that makes sense at all.
Right.
So, yeah, that seemed odd to me. Like, if everybody is saying consistently, we're getting all these complaints, what do we do about the complaints? Well, here's a pretty good way to manage it. Mm-hmm. I don't see a good argument against it. It's not not incredible amount of money. It's not a lot of time that would be required. It seems actually like a pretty great solution.
Some of the opposition to it, worth noting, they're looking at it from the perspective of, and it's a completely legitimate way to look at it, I think. They're saying this should be on the plate of the community who's receiving the benefits. So essentially what several supervisors said that night, I believe Dave Kaiser and Greg Wadhams, Junius and Romulus, they both said this isn't something we should be dealing with. Let Seneca Falls deal with it. It even seemed like they were saying, we understand that $5,000 isn't that much, but there is sort of, I understand what their perspective is on it. Now, one interesting argument to that philosophy, I guess, that I heard was saying, if Seneca County ever has to go into any kind of litigation with Seneca Meadows or with the town of Seneca Falls, the county will need some sort of data to back themselves up.
Right.
And to me, that was the first time I heard that. And B, I think that is somewhat of a solid stance to take, especially since that seems to be the only direction this issue goes, is to court.
Yeah.
So, I think
they can't imagine that if this ends up getting litigated on an odor issue, that a judge wouldn't say to them, well, where's your documentation about complaints you've received about odor? And they say, oh, well, you'll have to ask the guys across the table because they're the ones collecting it.
Right.
I mean, that's an untenable position to be in. So, yeah.
And also, full disclosure, anyone who reads that story in the Finger Lakes Times is going to see fingerlakes1.com, is going to see our name repeatedly in that story. Half of this company is a web development company, and it has nothing to do with the news side, and it has no impact on our coverage one way or another, but just something that I wanted to put out there. So when people read the story that I believe was written by Dave Shaw, who was there that night, really good story. We're there, but it doesn't have any impact, and it is one of those things where you do have to objectively look at this issue on whether Seneca County could logistically collect the data and what that data is going to be used for. I think that's one of the things that Seneca County or the Board of Supervisors has to really make clear moving forward if they are going to tackle this, is what is the reason you're collecting the data for. Right. If it's just for a what if or an in case, that's fine, but just make it very clear that that's why you're doing it.
Well, and I'd like to also raise this point, because this is something that in Ontario County also, and not just on landfill issues, but in general, I really still don't understand this Board of Supervisors form of government as opposed to a legislature makes things so territorial. And in this day and age, if people can't recognize the fact that we're in this together, and as Romulus goes, so goes Seneca County. As Seneca Falls goes, so goes Seneca County. If they can't see amongst themselves a linked fate on some of these big issues, then I really think they're missing something. So the idea that, well, this isn't our problem, let somebody else deal with it, that's the kind of thinking that gets us in trouble on a whole range of things.
Right.
So, yeah, I would hope that the full board would consider their responsibility to the county as a whole, both in terms of litigation, in terms of economic development, in terms of environmental impact, that this really is just kind of a common sense strategy for just making sure they're doing things properly.
Right. Now, speaking of doing things properly, Geneva has continued to sort of bubble, and it kind of felt like it came to a head on Monday.
It sure did.
When two committees held a press conference responding to a Finger Lakes Times article that ran on Sunday, which captured a really interesting statement from the DEC, and I'm not going to speak to it any further than that. I'm going to let you take the lead on this one because I think, you've been in front on this issue.
Well, unfortunately, but I mean, I think a lot of people, I haven't been doing as much work as the community organizing groups have been doing.
Right.
But as far as just trying to keep up with it, I read the Sunday paper, and I have to admit, I was sad. I was disappointed because clear as day, the DEC has said, sorry, that confidentiality claim is not true. And it's interesting because I went back because, I tell my students, context matters.
You're an ethics professor.
Right. Be critical readers. If someone tells you something, make sure you know the context. Don't misrepresent. So I pulled that contract that they were talking about with this confidentiality clause, and I brought it, and I'm not going to bore everybody by reading it, but it's online. It's part of all those foiled documents that the Geneva Believer blog has in a online document area.
We'll link to the contract in the story beneath this post on fingerlakes1.com so everyone can read it themselves.
So, but that confidentiality clause, which came out of nowhere, first indication that something was up is that at the 11th hour, all of a sudden, we couldn't have said anything anyway.
Right.
And if you have gone through 20 years thinking you're sworn to secrecy, but you don't remember it until 6 months into the public pressure, I find that hard to believe. Right? I mean, that's like what my kids did when they were little. They got caught, eating the cookies, and all of a sudden, oh, my sister did it at the last minute. Like, well, no, if she really had done it, you would have led with that. So anyway, so that's my poor kids. They don't deserve that analogy. But anyway, so I went to the contract, and it's this confidentiality provision is couched in a provision that's about preventing conflict of interest amongst bidders for a contract. So if you have information that might help a company you're associated with give a better bid, you're not allowed to tell that company what the information is, right? So if you say, hey, heads up, the levels are really this, and you might want to approach it this way, and that's going to make you in a better position to get the state money, that's not allowed.
Right.
But furthermore, the big issue is that, so not only did it not apply to what information Gordy had to begin with, but it doesn't apply to the city at all. I mean, the DEC says it doesn't apply to the city. And then they put in bold letters, as noted below, the only restriction on the city's release of information would relate to protection of personal proprietary or confidential business or financial data of persons or other companies.
Right.
And they said they don't need permission to release the testing data to the residents. I'm not sure how it could be any clearer that this was a bogus argument, that there was confidentiality clause. But instead of just saying, yeah, you know what, we're scared, we don't like to be criticized, we don't want to take the heat for this, so finally we're just going to put an end to it and say we're sorry. No, I mean, the article goes even deeper, and the Finger Lakes Times tries to say, how come you never mentioned this when we had a big meeting about it? And, well, there's a lot of contract provisions, and we forgot this one. We happen to forget the most critical one that would have explained why we haven't done anything and cleared this all up. So it just made me sad, because this is what happens when people are so worried about political fallout or personal reputation. Like, look at, everybody makes mistakes. Just say, sorry, now let's get to fixing it. But still, even when presented with just an ironclad piece of information, the knee-jerk reaction is defense. And that's disappointing, because that is not leadership.
So that story came out. The press conference was held by the Foundry Action Committee and the Women's Association on Monday night.
Right.
And then City Manager Matt Horn sent us a lengthy response to the various requests and demands that were laid out in that press conference. He basically said a lot of them were logistically impossible, not financially feasible, yada, yada, yada. Some of them were I'll call them intense. They're very intense. But I thought it was kind of strange, I guess, that after all of that and after all of this, the statement, and it was 5 or 6 lengthy paragraphs, still no mention of the elephant in the room, which is what you were just talking about for 3.5 minutes.
Right.
I mean, it has been practically the only thing outside of just the straight up cleanup. Obviously, people want their property cleaned up. It has been the only thing that people have been talking about outside of that, and yet there was still no mention of the accountability side. We made a mistake or anything like that. There was nothing, and I thought that was I thought that was, I don't want to call it suspicious, but it seemed odd and a little bit unprepared to me.
I wouldn't say unprepared because, I mean, and that's what's been disappointing to me. I mean, I think Matt's a great city manager, and I think he's doing wonderful stuff in Geneva. He's not stupid. He's not unprepared. He knows what he's doing.
Right.
So that's been difficult for me to reconcile the disconnect that, I mean, it's hard to maintain that this is just a misreading of the public because, like you said, I mean, it couldn't make it any more clear. Group demands probe of Foundry controversy.
Right.
And he sends a response that details other demands.
Right.
Which, fair. I mean, I thought his responses to those, made sense, and I think those are good things for discussion with the residents going forward. Yeah. But everybody seems to be missing, whether intentional or not, that the open wound in Geneva that needs addressing is the trust issue.
Right.
And that is something that could be addressed. It could be healed. You could start working on that. Instead, every statement, every action has just served to just maybe ground in some additional toxic dirt into that wound.
I see what you did there.
I didn't intend that. That just kind of went that way. But I think that's the problem. And even the picture, the picture in here, the picture that you guys ran with the story, you've got a counselor there who, granted, every time he's attempted to address this at a meeting, it's just rubbed all the residents the wrong way to begin with. So it's not that I was expecting healing from this particular counselor, but he's there videotaping it. I don't think he was videotaping it so he could go home and study it and write a handwritten note of apology to everybody who was speaking. I think it was an attempt to intimidate or have a gotcha moment. People are videotaping stuff all over the place. And that's, I don't have a problem with that. I feel like, people should be accountable, and accountability is doing things in public. But how can you stand there amongst people who are hurting and not interact other than to say, I'm watching what you're doing and I'm not going to address any of your concerns?
Okay, so 2 things. One, anytime I get a lengthy statement like this, just the reporter in me says, I don't know how much of this is genuine and how much of this is just literal prepared statement between lawyers and officials and all the. So I always take that kind of content with a grain of salt. That said, I think I would have preferred it, even if I think someone referred to it as Matt Horn doubled down in the story backing Eddington's idea that this was contractually obligated. I almost, if they were going to triple down on this whole thing, I feel like I would have been a little more comfortable with it in a way, because it would have been something more than this just, what are you talking about?
Right.
There's nothing to see here. What are you talking about? Nothing happened.
Right.
That to me is just a little bit strange. That's why I say, like, it seems odd. It doesn't seem like, if you looked at the list of ways to handle this situation, it doesn't even seem to be on the board.
Well,
pretending it's not happening, going back, we've talked about it before, the PR side of this. Pretending it's not there isn't really ever the way to go. And it's never really one of the options. You can double down on what your evidence says and what you firmly believe, if you firmly believe it. Or you can issue like an apology, or you could just say something happened, something went, whatever the case may be. You can even push it off onto your legal team. They gave us bad advice. Okay, whatever. There seem to be so many different ways you could go, and to go the direction of just not gonna address it. It seems like a literal miss.
Well, and I don't want to keep referring back to my kids, because my kids are great, and
You're killing them.
They don't do this. But when they were little, when they were very early in their moral development, this is exactly how kids act when they get caught doing something. First, it's, what are you talking about? I don't notice there's anything wrong whatsoever. And then it's these grasping at straws to come up with anything that might deflect guilt. Mm-hmm. Until finally, they understand it's not the end of the world if I just say, yeah, you caught me, you're right.
Right.
And I think that's what seems to be getting missed here. The residents of the neighborhood are not vicious, they're not mean, they've been harmed, but they've been really reasonable and tolerant in just saying, just help us figure out why this happened, and let's make sure it never happens to somebody else. Mm-hmm. And there would be so much good that would come from the city being a partner in that endeavor, instead of turning it into just stonewalling, to see if there's a way they can possibly get through it without ever having to say, we messed up.
Okay, so one thing I want to quickly add on that subject. I think that the city can be a partner in that, and maybe they can kind of affect some change on the city level, but I think there are fundamental, bigger issues at play that we've discussed before on the show. For example, a business goes out of business, and who are you holding accountable at that point? Because really, while the handling at the city level may have gone wrong at some point down the line, you also have a business who is profiting for a period of time at the city's expense, at the residents' expense. So I feel like there are several things that have to happen for that to fully be affected properly. So I don't want to say that this is going to be an easy fix, but as far as the directly in front of them issues that they're staring at right now, that they're dealing with at every single city council meeting, because the residents aren't going away. Yeah. It seems like there are easier ways to handle this, to make sure that it isn't an explosive topic week in and week out.
That the thing that's making it get worse instead of better. If you ask me, the city has an obligation to make it better. They can't make it perfect. And you're right. Ultimately, they're not responsible for the contamination. And I think it's important for the city to speak in a way that shows some solidarity with the residents, that this is something that happened to the city.
Right.
And what's problematic, though, like, for example, one of these excuses is, well, we just gathered the data and we handed it off to the state.
Right.
But the documents are out there.
Right.
That's not what happened, right? The city had a consulting firm that recommended that people be notified and that the stuff be cleaned up. So the city actually submitted a recommendation to the state to fund. So it's not like people didn't know. So saying, I didn't know, has run its course.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's upsetting because I really do think we're seeing kind of the worst of kind of human nature to avoid accountability. And I don't know. I mean, I've said, I should have known. I should have asked more questions. I should have known what I was looking at. And stuff comes across your desk and you say, I trust this is being handled. Yes, this needs to be submitted. Okay, great. Everybody needs to say, this is the role I played in it. And if I had it to do over, I certainly would have. And now I'd like to be part of helping make it right. But it's a difficult pill to swallow for some people, I guess. And it's sad.
So, speaking of difficult pills to swallow, I don't know if you've heard anything about this, but the dissolution vote in Rushville that happened on Tuesday, an incredibly polarized little community.
Yeah.
Between 666 and 700 residents in the village. The nays won 179 to 96, so dissolution will not happen. It was proposed a couple times before they finally got to the vote phase. They would have been, I believe, the fourth the fourth community to dissolve in the area. Lyons, Macedon, Seneca Falls, they would have been the fourth. There have been some questions raised about who was voting, whether they were legally registered to vote as village residents. Those are going to be some really interesting things to watch moving forward. If the vote is challenged or there was anything at all, that will be really interesting to watch. But to me, I thought all along the more interesting caveat in that story was, here you have a village that is smack dab on the borderline of two counties, where you would literally be taking not just residents and village residents and turning them into town residents, but you'd literally be taking village residents and turning them into residents of two different counties. I mean, they already are that technically, but it's strange to me that you would move through this process and not sort of see an ordinary dissolution process as controversial.
Yeah.
This just amped it all up 1,000-fold.
Right.
And, one of those things you sort of think about going into it. Do you have the numbers? I mean, something that I'm sure caught your eye was, 179 to 96. I'll round up and I'll call it 300 people. That's generous. 300 people voted out of 700 residents. We're back into the issue of people don't turn out to vote. And, I guess I'm curious what your perspective is on this.
Yeah, I also think, I think it's also a communication issue, which that seems to be the thing that I'm really harping on lately, because I wonder how many of the people who were voting no could have articulated accurate reasons that they were so opposed, or if it was that things are fine and we don't want them changing. But likewise, for the people who are voting yes, how many people voting yes could say, these are the tangible benefits we're expecting to see, and here are the reasons why it's not working the way we're currently doing it. And with the whole issue, it seemed to me that for the result to be what it is, that indicates to me there were a lot of people who felt they weren't sure what was actually going to happen.
Right.
And I don't know how you can move forward with a policy of that magnitude knowing that the residents don't understand what it will mean for them. You haven't been able to put into clear terms, here's what will happen if this goes forward, and here's what will happen if this doesn't go forward. And I understand, in their defense, that their town or village board would say, well, we've attempted to do that, and there were public forums and stuff. But sometimes just expecting people to come to you and get the information that you have is not sufficient. I mean, all the time. But let's just be
everything
generous.
that I read, you see, leading up to it, they had several community forums and presentations, and, they would talk about 20 or 30 attended this, 40 attended that. And in the grand scheme of things, that lends directly to your point.
Right.
I mean, that's a drop in the bucket.
This is like the biggest vote your community is going to take. There have to be some more creative strategies for really engaging people so that they know what it is that is at stake for that. So, yeah, I think the story of that really is not great communication. Plus, I mean, some people are saying, so what happens now? I mean, so that just speaks to the point also that nobody was clear about the details, and the details matter.
Well, and I'll also say that I think if there were an opportunity in terms of what information was being conveyed to residents, I think there was an opportunity to improve on the front of this is, and maybe this is an opportunity with every dissolution, but to make clear this will be the benefit in year 1 and in year 2 and in year 3, because that's oftentimes what's remembered. Your taxes are going to go down, but when you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years removed from dissolution, Seneca Falls is, I want to say, we dissolved at the end of 2011, approaching 7 years dissolved. There's the tax expense is going back up. It will eventually catch itself.
Right.
And I ask myself, people say, well, it's always better to eliminate a layer of government if you have the opportunity to. Well, that's good, but if your town government becomes as expensive as the combined governments of village and town before, what are you really gaining? I have trouble justifying that, because when you start to eliminate local government where people can actually participate and have a voice and be active and have an actual impact, you start to have to rely on these larger entities that have been proven to be less accommodating to the little guy. Look at state senate, look at assembly, everyone in rural upstate New York is unhappy with Albany.
Right.
That's because it's a giant body that listens to the mass down in New York City much more than they listen to the little guy up here. Right. So why would you eliminate your voice? And that's what dissolving effectively does.
That's interesting, because I hadn't really thought of it that way. I, in general, have a favorable attitude toward dissolution, because I do feel like there are too many layers of government around here. But the point you're making about further disconnecting people from decision making is a really important and valid point. So I think that's true. I mean, maybe that's part of what needs to be in the mix in these discussions. It's not just about keeping the existing way of doing business and just moving it up the chain.
Right.
It's got to be, in combination, a different way of engaging residents in how business is done altogether.
You know what I think? I think about it, especially now with all this discussion about shared services. It seems to me like the really easy way of going about sharing services without actually having to go service by service and say, we want to share this service and this service and this service. And instead of, going through highway and going through water and sewer and all of these other fire and police and all these other services, instead of going service by service, you say, well, we'll just dissolve the whole village and everything will roll over into the town and everyone will be happier because everything will just be covered by the town.
Right.
And it just, to me, like, if you're going to go through the exercise of sharing services, which I think is a good idea and frankly something that every governing body in upstate New York's been doing for the last 2 decades anyway. Right. Why not do it the right way instead of the sort of lumped, rolled way? Yeah,
that's a good... I'm just thinking, town of Geneva and city of Geneva, I think, have a ton of areas where the idea that there are 2 separate governing bodies just doesn't make sense to me. But, even when we were talking about a water district or sewer district that would be co-managed, city and town, the idea should never be, well, just have the town turn that over to the city, or just have the city turn that over to the town.
Exactly.
It should be, we're going to create a new shared district, which will have representatives from both groups, and a new way of actually delivering and monitoring that service. Because I think you've gotten to a really excellent point. Like, sometimes the problem with the service delivery is not necessarily that there are too many people doing it. It's that the management and oversight is not effectively deploying the resources in the way that could serve everybody the best possible way. So you could reorganize that without reorganizing the entire municipality.
Right. The budgets are tight across the board.
Right.
So I understand like the financial need, but a lot of times, I'll feel bad for just the employees that get saddled with all of this.
Yeah.
The village, good for them. They get to dissolve, and village residents get to pay a little less. They don't have to pay a village tax bill anymore. But now you've got town employees who are saddled with executing all of the responsibilities, not just the oversight part. And I agree. Your point is precisely on, where you need to have representatives from both sides on this sort of mutual effort. But then you also have to think about the people who are going to have to carry out all that work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
We're just solving the world's problems.
Well, no, let's not get carried away. So an audit is coming in Seneca County. The Mental Health Services Committee considered a resolution on Tuesday, which would initiate the process of executing an external audit of self-reported discrepancies with Medicaid billing. Discrepancies were found after the Director of Community Services left and a new director stepped in. County Manager John Shepard said the internal audit is normal under those circumstances when you have a director exit and a new one come in.
Okay.
And I assume that's just for the benefit of the new guy coming in, so he or she is not saddled with problems from the last time around or any issues that might have existed. But law requires that they report any discrepancies that exceed $5,000, so billing issues that exceed $5,000, or any documentation issues where perhaps the documentation was not sufficient for the billing requests made.
Okay.
So now the full board will decide next month. If I would assume they'll pass this resolution without much thought, because this could literally cost, as one supervisor told me, it could cost the county big time.
So is the issue that they've identified, which of the two is it? Is there a discrepancy more than 5,000?
It's a combination.
Or is it the reporting? Oh,
it's
okay.
a combination. And to me, it sounds, just in the brief explanation I was given by the county manager and some people who work in the health field, it's kind of easy to get into where if one is being violated, the other one probably is too, or vice versa. So the way it was sort of explained in a nutshell to me was you see a patient for whatever, 20 times. If their condition does not improve after the 10th or 11th visit, those other visits that you may have just continued billing for because you thought they're being seen and whatever, it's
right,
part of it, it's
service.
necessary, whatever. Medicaid can say, whoa, you aren't meeting the criteria, you aren't meeting the threshold. Well, no. You're not getting anything for these. You're not getting reimbursed for these. So to me, it kind of seems like it could be a combination of a lot of factors. But I will say this, the mental health department in Seneca County, this is a space to watch, because there has been a tremendous amount of instability in the last, say, 2 years. Not just the typical employee exodus that has plagued Seneca County as a whole. It's been well documented now. They've lost between 47 and 63 employees over the last 3 years just due to poor compensation, according to the county. But on top of this, you have these other sort of what look like internal issues that are now being addressed. So it will be very interesting to see how this sort of plays out over the next, and there isn't really, unfortunately, a lot to discuss on this, because it is kind of just like a black and white wait and see.
Right.
But I wanted to talk about it because I think this is probably one of the most important issues that the county board is addressing or will address this summer. because there's only 2 more meetings before the end of summer. The end of summer is coming.
Well, let's not talk about that.
So I guess I do want to get your opinion quick on you were a city councilor. When these kind of issues came up, or when they come up, do elected officials kind of feel like, do elected representatives kind of feel helpless in a sense? Because it's not like you can go do the billing for, you can't do the billing for Seneca County, but you're kind of responsible for ensuring that everything is happening the right way. So
I think that's always the tension, and that's always, again, going back to the Foundry, you do feel responsible. You do feel like I should have taken a closer look. I should have known. I should have asked more questions. But on the other hand, the constant drumbeat in local government is don't micromanage your staff. Don't, you hired these people because they have a job to do. Let them do their job. And when it comes to things like billing, when it comes to things like, interacting with a state agency, when it comes to things like buying pencils, right? You don't necessarily want to say why those pencils or why this. However, and that's to the chagrin of my colleagues over the 16 years, that I was on the ask a lot of questions end of the spectrum instead of the trust everything that's being said end of the spectrum.
And there's a balance to be.
But there's still a balance. Yeah. It's still trying to figure out on what issues do you defer to what you think is the better judgment of the people for whom this is their full-time job. And, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because maybe the takeaway for the Board of Supervisors is going to be some oversight provision. Maybe they have a committee that needs to be doing a more periodic audit or doing something like that. So the question is always, I think, for the elected officials, are you exercising enough oversight? And are there ways that you could ask for reports or data that would give you just a way of checking in every once in a while and making sure that the person you've entrusted to do the right thing is not missing something? It doesn't even have to, I'm not even saying there has to be anything wrong about what's being done.
Right.
Just, is this the best way to do it? Is this how other people or other places are doing it? And just looking at it that way. So.
And of course, we couldn't possibly get through one of our podcasts without talking about state legislature, because nothing's ever easy. It's over, it's not over, it's kind of meandering in a weird gray area. Were good things done, were bad things missed? Brittany's Law, to me, the fact that still is not law is absurd. And that alone has really done a good job of crushing my faith in seeing anything positive come out of either chamber and actually make it to the governor's desk and actually be signed into law. Assembly won't touch it. Senate passed it 8 years in a row, I believe.
With bipartisan support.
Yeah, it's not there have been some questions raised about who's getting money and what domestic violence advocacy groups are behind it and don't like it. And to me, it just seems very, very easy, if there are issues with it, make those issues known, fix it, pass it, get it done.
Aha. There is the issue, though.
But that is, and I'm not even going to talk about what my miss is, because I'm going to mention it here in a couple minutes. I'll let you talk about what you thought, what your takeaway was from this session as it kind of snails to a dying end.
Yeah, I think, and this was going to be part of my hit, so I guess I'll just go right into it. Assemblyman Kolb, who I think has been doing a really excellent job as the Assembly Minority Leader, and that will shock everybody, right, that I'm complimenting a very prominent Republican. But again, I'm not partisan. I just want people to do their job well. So I think he's been doing an excellent job, and I don't agree with him on everything, but I think he does an excellent job. He just put out a press release about how this term has highlighted the problem of this 4 men in a room way of doing state business. It's these guys get in there, they decide, here's what we're going to push forward, here's what we're going to hold back, here are the people that we're going to make happy, here are the people we don't care about. And then the full body representing us, all of us, doesn't get to actually, in good faith, negotiate any of this. Mm-hmm. It's the fix is in. I mean, the Senate's got their voting block, the Assembly's got their voting block, and you can't break through it. And that is not work in the public interest, that's for sure.
So what was your miss then for the week?
Well, let's see. I mean, apart from what's going on in Geneva, which is just kind of a perpetual miss, I was going to talk about the Environmental Affairs Committee in Seneca Falls. Just the general feeling that just this very simple monitoring system will not pass the full board, that I felt is a miss. And in general, I think the miss
it might be precautionary.
Yeah.
As I don't know that as Supervisor Trout has spoken about it at meetings, I don't think he's necessarily drawn a line in the sand and chosen one side or another. I think the tone of his comment during the debate seemed to be very towards, I don't think this will pass.
Yeah.
And, it's a wait and see thing. But I understand your...
Yeah, I think that's my miss. My miss is just people not acting in the public interest. Again.
So, my side, I'm going to go with my miss being, and I haven't followed the development today on this issue, but the Lake Ontario relief package, which was $90 million, and now it's $55 million, and I'm seeing different numbers and hearing different things, and once again, goes back to the dysfunction of Albany. You get one thing out there, and it seems that most people are on board with it. The governor's on board with it. The chambers are on board with it, but it doesn't work. And then you have a new package, and you're not really sure why it came out or why it's happening like that. It doesn't seem to add up. My hit for the week, resounding, the Seneca County Board of Supervisors reappointed County Manager John Shepard to a new term. He is organizationally one of the, if not the best thing that has happened to Seneca County. That position has been a revolving door. They have had poor leadership, and I have railed against this Board of Supervisors multiple times for micromanaging every issue that comes up and that comes before them, instead of allowing, to a certain degree, for the county manager and other employees to do their job. Right. And having you come back at me earlier with the, you have to find the balance between oversight and, obsessive behavior, which is what it kind of, you're flirting with. You kind of have to walk really fine line and just stick with it. But that's that. And we're going to be back in probably 2 weeks. Yep. You have a vacation, or you are going to be away for a few weeks. So we might be getting a different different counterpart to throw in that desk across from me. Okay. We'll see how that we'll see where that goes. That's going to do it for this week's pod. We'll be back in a couple weeks. Remember, hit that subscribe button if you're checking us out on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and give us a follow on Twitter. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the Debrief Podcast.